Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my commentary today. President Vladimir Zelensky's rejection of the 28-point peace framework marks one of the most defining political moments of Ukraine's modern history. It is not merely the dismissal of a Washington-related proposal. It is a deliberate act of moral positioning at a time when the strategic environment is turning sharply against Ukraine. His words, "We are made of steel, but even the strongest metal can convey both resilience and exhaustion." They reveal a leader conscious that the war has stretched the nation to its psychological and material limits, yet unwilling to cross what he sees as the red line of national dignity. At the center of his message is the reminder of the 20th of May 2019, the day he took the presidential oath to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. By invoking that date, Zelensky signals that any settlement requiring the formal surrender of occupied territories would violate the essence of that promise. For him, sovereignty is not negotiable, even under the most severe conditions of war. This is not the language of a politician weighing tactical compromises. It is the language of a leader who views territorial integrity as inseparable from national identity. In that sense, his rejection is not impulsive, but rooted in a long-standing constitutional and ethical stance. Yet Zelensky's defiance does not mask the strategic dilemma he faces. He openly frames the choice facing Ukraine as between accepting a painful agreement and entering a winter of heightened vulnerability militarily, economically, and socially. His rhetoric acknowledges that Ukraine is nearing a critical threshold where resilience and strain coexist. He understands the growing doubts inside Washington and European capitals, the shifting calculations of allies who must justify prolonged support to divided domestic audiences. Still, he asserts that a peace without dignity is a false peace, undermining the very legitimacy of the Ukrainian state. His warning about an intense week ahead reflects the broader pressures converging on Kyiv diplomatic negotiations, information campaigns aimed at fracturing public unity and mounting speculation about Ukraine's political stability. Zelensky recognizes that external actors, both friendly and adversarial, will seek to exploit the fatigue of a population battered by war. His response is to anchor Ukraine's position in unity, calling citizens to remember who the real enemy is. It is above all a message aimed at preventing internal fragmentation, which he sees as a more immediate danger than even battlefield setbacks. In rejecting the 28-point plan, Zelensky positions Ukraine not simply as a country fighting territorial aggression, but as a nation defending its moral foundations. The essence of his argument is that sovereignty cannot be traded for short-term relief. This is the heart of his defiance, the belief that Ukraine must endure hardship now to avoid a deeper humiliation later. His stance is principled but carries immense risk. Still, for Zelensky, the alternative, a settlement that compromises dignity, would fracture the national identity more profoundly than any missile strike. President Zelensky's decision to reject the 28-point settlement is not merely a rhetorical gesture. It is a strategic gamble with profound implications, a choice that may determine whether Ukraine preserves its sovereignty or endures an even deeper national strain. The paradox at the heart of this moment is clear. By rejecting a deeply unfavorable peace, Ukraine protects its dignity. Yet by doing so, it may expose itself to greater hardship, diminishing leverage, and a narrowing set of strategic options. This is the dilemma of a state fighting a stronger adversary while depending on external support, whose political durability is uncertain. The first element of this gamble concerns time. Time is no longer on Ukraine's side. Battlefield lines have stagnated. Ammunition shortages are chronic. Mobilization fatigue is accelerating, and both Europe and the United States are struggling to sustain unwavering support. Zelensky understands these constraints, but he also understands that agreeing to a peace that legitimizes territorial loss risks setting a precedent that undermines not only Ukraine's sovereignty, but the broader European security order. From his perspective, a rushed deal now could institutionalize a long-term imbalance that would place Ukraine in permanent strategic dependency. Yet this moral clarity collides with a harsh reality. Rejection may entail a higher cost militarily, economically, and diplomatically. The winter months ahead will strain Ukraine's energy grid, public finances, and domestic morale. Russia will interpret Kyiv's stance as evidence that Ukraine is unwilling to compromise under any circumstances, encouraging Moscow to escalate pressure rather than negotiate. The risk for Zelensky is that the very act of defending sovereignty today could paradoxically shape conditions that compel Ukraine into a weaker negotiating position tomorrow. A second dimension of the gamble lies in the shifting geopolitical posture of the United States. For Washington, the war is becoming less about open-ended support and more about strategic prioritization. The Trump camp views a prolonged conflict as strategically inefficient and politically unsustainable. In their calculation, American power must be redirected toward global competition with China rather than being indefinitely tied down in Eastern Europe. Zelensky's refusal may therefore be interpreted in Washington as a misalignment with American political timelines. This could translate into more conditional aid delays in military packages or a firmer push for political concessions. Ukraine risks becoming a partner whose determination, though admirable, complicates U.S. strategic recalibration. The third element is domestic vulnerability. As the conflict drags on, Ukraine's internal cohesion is increasingly tested. Economic pressures deepen, demographic losses accelerate, and political opposition grows more vocal. Zelensky's rejection of the deal requires the Ukrainian public to shoulder another year of hardship, another winter of uncertainty. The question looming over Kyiv is whether the population's resilience, remarkable as it has been, can sustain yet another cycle of sacrifice. Zelensky's gamble also contains an ethical dimension that I would emphasize. Can a nation defend its moral principles without overextending its material capacity? The defense of sovereignty is noble, but sovereignty must be sustained by viable long-term structures, economy, alliances, and public unity. A decision rooted in dignity must still survive the arithmetic of war. In rejecting the deal, Zelensky asserts that Ukraine will not bend to geopolitical expediency. The danger is that the world around him may become less patient while Russia becomes more emboldened. This is the tension at the core of his strategic gamble, the belief that moral courage can outlast the tightening constraints of a brutal, drawn-out conflict. Ukraine's refusal to accept the 28-point peace plan intersects directly with the shifting political dynamics of the United States. What Zelensky frames as an act of sovereign principle, Washington increasingly views through the prism of strategic efficiency, domestic politics, and global prioritization. This divergence between moral conviction in Kiev and strategic recalibration in the U.S. now defines one of the war's most consequential tensions. The fundamental reality is this: U.S. support for Ukraine is neither infinite nor unconditional. While Washington remains committed to Ukraine's self-defense, the political climate has changed dramatically since the early months of the war. What was once framed as a definitive stand for democracy is now entangled in partisan debate, budgetary constraints, and a broader reassessment of America's long-term strategic posture. For the Trump faction in particular, the war represents a misallocation of American power. Their argument is rooted in geopolitical hierarchy that the defining challenge to U.S. global influence comes not from Russia but from China. In that context, a protracted conflict in Eastern Europe is seen as a distraction, one that drains U.S. resources, divides NATO, and limits Washington's ability to pivot toward Asia. Viewed through this lens, Zelensky's rejection of a proposed settlement becomes more than a policy disagreement. It becomes a potential obstacle to Washington's grand strategy. From the American perspective, the central concern is not whether Ukraine is morally justified in continuing the fight. Most U.S. policymakers agree that Ukraine's sovereignty has been violated, but whether the strategic return on continued support can be sustained. The 28-point plan, flawed as it is, represents Washington's desire to shape an endgame that stabilizes the European security environment without committing the U.S. to open-ended military and financial obligations. Zelensky's refusal may therefore be read in Washington as Kyiv acting on moral absolutism at a time when the U.S. is seeking geopolitical consolidation. This does not mean that America will abandon Ukraine, but it does suggest a shift toward conditional engagement support calibrated to U.S. political constraints. Washington may press KE more forcefully on reforms, demand clearer military objectives, or link aid to progress at the negotiating table. The risk for Zelensky is that his principled stance will collide with the structural limits of American political patience. A partnership once defined by shared purpose may slowly evolve into one defined by differing timelines. Another challenge is the growing U.S. domestic debate over priorities. Inflation, border policy, and competition with China dominate American political discourse. The political bandwidth for a long European war is shrinking. Zelensky's rejection of the deal, though morally coherent, places him at odds with a Washington political establishment increasingly inclined toward pragmatism over principle. I would argue that this moment reveals a deeper problem: the mismatch between Ukraine's existential stakes and America's strategic calculus. For Ukraine, territorial compromise threatens national identity. For the U.S., indefinite support for a stalemated conflict is a threat to geopolitical flexibility. These two logics cannot coexist indefinitely without tension. Thus, Zelensky's refusal forces Washington to confront its own limits. The partnership remains intact, but the foundation is shifting. The question ahead is whether moral resolve in Kiev can withstand the structural constraints of American politics, or whether Ukraine will find itself gently or forcefully pressured back toward the negotiating table on terms not of its own choosing. Russia will not view Zelensky's rejection of the 28-point settlement as an act of principled defiance. Moscow will view it as strategic confirmation evidence that Kyiv is isolated under increasing strain and trapped in a war whose trajectory is gradually turning in Russia's favor. For the Kremlin, every refusal to negotiate is interpreted not as an expression of national dignity, but as an indicator that Ukraine has fewer pathways left and fewer external lifelines willing to carry the burden indefinitely. The first and most immediate consequence is time asymmetry. Russia believes time strengthens its position and weakens Ukraine's. The Russian economy, though heavily sanctioned, has adapted to wartime mobilization. Energy revenues continue to flow through alternative markets. The military-industrial complex is expanding, and the Kremlin's political apparatus remains consolidated, unburdened by electoral pressures. Ukraine, by contrast, faces the opposite trajectory. Depleted resources, fatigue among civilians and soldiers, demographic loss, and the real risk of declining Western support for Moscow. Zelensky's rejection signals that Ukraine remains on a path it cannot sustain indefinitely. Second, Russia will interpret the refusal as a sign that Washington and Kyiv are no longer fully aligned. Even the perception of divergence is valuable to Moscow. The Kremlin strategy has always relied on exploiting gaps within the Western coalition between the U.S. and Europe, between European capitals themselves, and now potentially between Washington's political factions and Kiev's leadership. If the United States begins shifting toward conditional support or insists more firmly on negotiations, Russia will amplify that message both domestically and internationally. The Kremlin will argue that Ukraine is rejecting reasonable compromises encouraged by its own allies. Even if this interpretation is inaccurate, The narrative itself serves Russia's diplomatic goals. Third, Russia will likely escalate pressure through targeted measures rather than full-scale offensives. The Kremlin understands that Ukraine's most vulnerable areas are its infrastructure, energy, grid, and economic stability. Winter has historically been Russia's preferred time to tighten the economic and psychological screws. We should therefore expect increased missile strikes on electrical systems, logistical hubs, and transportation networks, not as part of a decisive military push, but to deepen domestic strain and challenge Kyiv's political unity. By intensifying hardship, Russia seeks to shift Ukrainian public opinion toward the belief that continued resistance is unsustainable. Fourth, Moscow will exploit information warfare to frame the rejection as Zelensky's personal intrigence. Russian media will emphasize that Ukraine turned down peace, portraying the conflict as the result of Kyiv's stubbornness and Western manipulation. This narrative is designed not only for the Russian public but for international audiences, especially countries in the global South, who already view the war as a U.S.-Russia confrontation rather than a struggle for Ukrainians on tiny, by casting Zelensky as unwilling to compromise Moscow attempts to reclaim moral ground, however cynically, in global diplomacy. Finally, Russia sees the moment as an opening to solidify long-term territorial claims. The longer Ukraine refuses negotiations, the more invested Moscow becomes in integrating the occupied regions politically, economically, and administratively. From Russia's perspective, rejection of a peace plan reinforces the justification for deeper annexation. If Kyiv refuses to compromise, then Moscow must secure the territories by force and for good. In short, Zelensky's refusal strengthens Russia's belief that persistence, not breakthrough, is the path to victory. Moscow sees a Ukraine under strain, a West divided by political cycles, and a global environment increasingly receptive to the argument that endless war benefits no one. For Russia, this is not a setback, but an opportunity, one it will exploit with patience, pressure, and calculated confidence. Zelensky's rejection of the 28-point peace proposal leads us to the most complex dimension of this crisis, the ethical paradox at the heart of Ukraine's decision-making. On the one hand, the refusal is unmistakably an act of moral courage. Zelensky insists that sovereignty is not a bargaining chip and that no leader has the legitimacy to surrender territory that belongs to the Ukrainian people. On the other hand, the decision carries enormous risk. By dismissing a settlement endorsed or encouraged by segments of the U.S. political establishment, Zelensky places Ukraine on a path of heightened uncertainty with consequences that extend far beyond rhetoric. The central ethical question is simple yet profound. Can a nation defend its principles without jeopardizing its survival? This is the dilemma Zelensky now embodies. Moral clarity is essential in wartime leadership, but a nation also requires durability, military, economic, and demographic to sustain that morality over time. If the material foundations erode faster than the principles can be defended, even the most righteous stance becomes vulnerable to collapse. Zelensky is consciously choosing the path of dignity over expediency. He frames the war not merely as a territorial conflict, but as a civilizational struggle in which Ukraine must reject the logic of coercion. If Ukraine yields under pressure, he argues the message to other aggressors around the world is unmistakable force works. This is the moral argument underpinning his refusal. In this sense, Zelensky is not gambling for personal political survival, but for the preservation of a national identity rooted in sovereignty, independence, and moral agency. Yet the risks of this stance are undeniable. By refusing negotiations, Ukraine may face a future in which Western support becomes increasingly conditional. Domestic exhaustion deepens. Russia intensifies military and economic pressure. The diplomatic landscape shifts toward conflict fatigue, leaving Kyiv isolated. None of these outcomes stems from a failure of principles. They stem from the cold arithmetic of geopolitics. The danger is that moral courage, if not matched by sustainable capability, can lead a nation into a more precarious position. This is the ethical tightrope Zelensky is walking. He must maintain the conviction that Ukraine's cause is just while also ensuring that the country has the capacity to endure another year or several years of war. The challenge is not simply to defend territory, but to defend the long-term viability of the Ukrainian state. If the cost of rejecting compromise is a gradual erosion of national resilience, then the very principles Zelensky seeks to protect may become harder to uphold. Still, Zelensky's decision reflects a deeper truth about sovereignty. It cannot survive if it is defined by external pressure rather than internal conviction. His refusal asserts that Ukraine will not be shaped by geopolitical convenience. It is a stance that carries both honor and peril. In the end, Ukraine faces not a choice between victory and defeat, but between dignity with risk and compromise with uncertainty. Zelensky has chosen the former. History will determine whether that choice strengthens the nation or forces it to confront an even more difficult negotiation in the future.